She was the daughter of a baronet, a descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough and one of the most photographed women in Edwardian England. The London press called her the beautiful Mrs. Atherton and a fascinating disturber of society. She had an affair with the second Duke of Westminster while her husband was fighting the Boers in South Africa. The King of England personally intervened to keep the scandal out of the British newspapers. Her husband refused £40,000 from the Grosvenor family lawyers and filed for divorce anyway. Her first child, a 4-year-old boy named Walter, was killed in a carriage accident when the horse bolted after being frightened by a bear being led along a London street. She sued a baron for breach of promise. She was named as co-respondent in a Scottish divorce case so sensational that the court required a scale model of a seaside hotel to be constructed as evidence. Her own lady's maid testified against her. Her sister-in-law called her a disreputable woman. She was awarded 1 farthing in damages. She fled to Egypt, socialised with the men who would later discover Tutankhamun's tomb, and was compared by their wives to the devilish heroine of a popular novel. She published her own novel about a mock marriage and its destruction of a political career. She was struck by a motor car on Regent Street and broke her collarbone. She remarried at 47, only to discover her new husband in bed with his 24-year-old stepdaughter during the honeymoon. 10 weeks after the wedding, she sat down in her Mayfair bedroom, put on her jewels, wrote 2 letters, barricaded the door with furniture, and shot herself in the head with a sporting gun. She was 47 years old. She left no will. Her estate was valued at £8,206. The newspapers that had feasted on her scandals for 18 years wrote about her death for months. In today's episode, we trace how the daughter of a baronet became the most notorious society beauty of Edwardian London, how the British establishment conspired to protect a duke from the consequences of an affair that everyone in the drawing rooms of Mayfair already knew about, and how the woman at the centre of it all spent 2 decades navigating a social system that rewarded beauty, punished desire, and offered no exit that did not involve destruction. Hello and welcome to today's episode on Manor Archives and the history of wealthy families around the world. My name is Clarissa and I'm your narrator for this episode. And if you'd like even more on the hidden history of wealthy families, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Mabel Louisa Dean. Paul was born in 1872, the daughter of Sir Edward John Dean Paul, 4th Baronet, an art collector whose death in 1895, when Mabel was 23, left her with a title to claim connection to and a social position to maintain without the financial resources that her father's generation had taken for granted. Her mother was Elisa Monckton Ramsay, the daughter of Major General James Ramsay, the younger brother of the 12th Earl of Dalhousie. The Dean Paul baronetcy traced its lineage through Sir John Dean Paul, 1st Baronet, a prominent London banker whose firm had collapsed spectacularly in 1855, resulting in criminal prosecution and a sentence of transportation, a family scandal that had been absorbed into the fabric of the family history by the time Mabel was born, but which cast a long shadow over the Dean Paul name. The family was connected through the maternal line to the first Duke of Marlborough. They were old, titled, and positioned within the social hierarchy at a level that was high enough to grant access to the drawing rooms of the powerful, and low enough that maintaining that access required constant effort, constant visibility, and the kind of beauty that could open doors that a baronet's income alone could not. She had an elder sister, Edith, who would marry Richard George Stackpoole, grandson of the first Duke de Stackpoole, and a younger sister, Gladys Lisa, who would die in Matches Fontaine in the Cape Colony in 1902, during the Boer War. She had a younger brother, Aubrey, who would become the 5th baronet, serve as a captain in the Northumberland Fusiliers, convert to Roman Catholicism in 1914, marry the daughter of the Polish violin virtuoso Henryk Wieniawski after being introduced by the great soprano Nellie Melba, and father a daughter named Brenda Dean Paul. Brendy would become one of the most notorious of the bright young things in the 1920s, a silent film actress and drug addict who spent time in Holloway Prison, was found walking naked around her flat, answering the door in the nude, augmenting her income through arrangements that the police learned about from a former flatmate, and who died at 52, worn down by cocaine and a life that had gone wrong from the beginning. The family's talent for self-destruction was, it seems, inherited. It ran through the generations with the persistence of a title and the force of a compulsion. Mabel was tall, slender, and by every account of the era, strikingly beautiful. Her looks generated the kind of interest that had not been seen in London society since Lily Langtry, the famous mistress of King Edward VII. She was photographed by George Charles Beresford in 1902, and that portrait now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London. A full-length portrait appeared in the King and His Navy and Army magazine in August 1904. The press described her as exquisitely gowned, displaying priceless jewels. Her friends called her Nancy. The society columns could not leave her alone. At the age of 20, on July 30th, 1892, she married Captain Thomas James Atherton at St. Paul's Church, Knightsbridge. Atherton was the son of Sir William Atherton, who had served as Solicitor General and Attorney General of England, and Lady Agnes Atherton. He was 16 years her senior, educated at Charterhouse and Cambridge, and a serving officer in the 12th Royal Lancers, one of the oldest cavalry regiments in the British Army. His brother, Major Walter Hyde Atherton, of the 5th Dragoon Guards, had died a hero at the Battle of Abu Klea in the Sudan in 1885, part of the ill-fated expedition to relieve General Gordon at Khartoum. The Athertons were a military family of standing and reputation, the kind of family that expected its sons to serve and its daughters-in-law to behave, and the marriage announced in the society pages was conventional in every respect. The bride was beautiful, the groom was respectable, the ceremony was at the right church. Clifton society noted the approaching marriage with the standard formulas of approval. The couple took a residence at 82 Sloane Street, Kensington, a fashionable address in one of London's most fashionable districts, and Mrs. Atherton, as she now styled herself, began the process of establishing herself within the social world that her beauty and her husband's military credentials had opened to her. She did not style herself Lady Atherton, which she was not entitled to, nor did she use her maiden name, which would have signalled a distance from her husband that would have been socially unreadable. From the date of her marriage, she was Mrs. Atherton, and it was under this name that she would become famous, infamous, and ultimately tragic. Their first son, Walter Wentworth Atherton, was born on June 4th, 1893. 5 years later, in 1898, Walter was killed in an accident that belongs to a different century in its strangeness and its cruelty. The 4-year-old was travelling in his father's brougham carriage with his nurse, Kate Thompson, when a bear being led along the road frightened the horse. Bears were, at the end of the 19th century, still occasionally led through the streets of London by their handlers, a practice that was considered quaint by some and dangerous by those who understood that horses could smell bears from a considerable distance and were terrified of them. The horse bolted, the carriage collided with a wagon, the nurse was thrown into the road. Walter suffered a fractured skull and was taken to Middlesex Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. At the inquest held in Marylebone, Captain William Cosley Atherton, Walter's uncle, testified that he knew of similar incidents and that horses took fright at the scent of bears. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death. An opinion was expressed that bears should not be led along public thoroughfares. The opinion was noted. The child was buried. The law was not changed. The loss of a child in such arbitrary and grotesque circumstances would have tested any marriage. The specificity of the death, the bear, the bolting horse, the nurse thrown from the carriage, the 4-year-old with his skull broken, has the quality of a Victorian morality tale in which the universe punishes its characters through instruments of absurd and disproportionate cruelty. The Athertons' marriage was already under strain, and what came next would destroy it. A second son, Aubrey James Atherton, was born on April 5, 1899. Later that year, Captain Atherton's regiment was deployed to South Africa for the Boer War. Atherton had entered the 12th Royal Lancers in 1880 as a serving officer and had risen through the ranks with the steady competence of a career military man. His regiment came under the command of Lord Methuen at the Battle of Modder River, and Atherton himself was heavily engaged at the Battle of Magersfontein, the Siege of Kimberley, and the Battle of Diamond Hill. After the death in action of the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Ogilvie, the 11th Earl of Airlie, Atherton succeeded to the command of his regiment. He was subsequently promoted to lieutenant colonel and led his troops in cavalry sweeps in the vicinity of Rustenburg, Magaliesburg, and the Elands River. He was mentioned in Lord Roberts's dispatch of November 29, 1900, and in the London Gazette of September 10, 1901. On September 27, 1901, he received the Companion of the Bath. He was, in other words, fighting a war, winning a war, and being decorated for fighting a war while his wife was doing something else entirely in the Cape Colony. Mrs. Atherton had followed her husband to South Africa. She was among a group of society women who arrived in the Cape Colony with the stated purpose of nursing wounded soldiers. The distinction between what they said they were doing and what they were actually doing was a source of considerable irritation to the military establishment. Sir Frederick Trevis, the distinguished war surgeon who had performed King Edward VII's appendectomy and who had treated men in some of the most brutal engagements of the conflict, described the presence of society, women like Mrs. Atherton, as a plague. Lord Kitchener's outburst about women and flies when discussing ladies of social standing and their particular brand of war work mentioned her name specifically. The war zone was not, for women of her class, a hospital ward. It was a social theatre in which beauty, boredom and proximity to men in uniform could produce exactly the kind of complications that the military command was trying to prevent. The travel itself carried genuine danger. Mrs. Atherton's younger sister Gladys would die in Matthiasfontein during 1902, a reminder that the Cape Colony was not a drawing room and that the consequences of being there were real, even for women who had come for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. Mrs. Atherton proceeded to the camp at Modder River and there encountered Captain Hugh Grosvenor, the 2nd Duke of Westminster, who was 21 years old, aide-de-camp to the Governor of the Cape Colony, Lord Milner, and heir to one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. The Grosvenor family's wealth was of a scale that placed them in a category separate from ordinary aristocratic wealth. They owned vast tracts of central London, including Belgravia and substantial portions of Mayfair. The family seat was Eaton Hall in Cheshire, a country house of palatial proportions. The Duke kept 17 Rolls-Royce automobiles, 2 sailing vessels, and a private railway built specifically to carry him from Eaton Hall directly into London, where his townhouse, Grosvenor House, occupied one of the most prominent sites in Mayfair before being leased to the United States for use as the American embassy. He was known within family circles as Bendor after a racehorse Bendor that had won the Epsom Derby in 1880, the year after his birth. He was described by those who knew him as a pure Victorian who had eyes for his shotgun, his hunters, his dogs, and who enjoyed hiding diamonds under the pillows of his mistresses. He was 21, spectacularly wealthy and spectacularly careless about the consequences of his appetites. Mrs. Atherton was 28 years old. The American newspapers, in a gesture of uncharacteristic kindness, reported her as being 3 years younger. An affair between Mrs. Atherton and the Duke began at the military camp and continued when both parties reached Cape Town, where they met at the Mount Nelson Hotel. The hotel was and remains one of the grand colonial establishments of southern Africa, a setting in which the collision between Edwardian social rules and human desire could unfold in comfortable surroundings with adequate wine and reliable mail service to London. When Lieutenant Colonel Atherton learned of his wife's infidelity, he arranged for her safe passage back to England, while the governor of the colony, Lord Milner, made certain that the young Duke was not on the same steamer. Both ships stopped at Madeira. The affair resumed on the island. Stories of the affair began circulating in the American newspapers by the end of February 1901. The timing was devastating. The Duke of Westminster had married another socialite, Constance Cornwallis West, known as Sheila, on February 16, 1901, in a ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, that was covered in the London papers as a major society event. He was named as co-respondent in Atherton's divorce petition a week after the wedding. The American papers published the details freely. The Brooklyn Eagle ran the story under the headline, "Major Atherton Files Suit for Divorce Against His Wife. Sensational Society Scandal in England." The San Francisco Call reported that the Duke had been named a week after his own marriage. The Philadelphia Inquirer put it on the front page. The British papers published nothing. The suppression of the story in Britain was not the work of editors exercising discretion. It was the work of the Crown. King Edward VII, who had ascended the throne in January 1901 upon the death of Queen Victoria, and who had his own complicated history with extramarital affairs, including his famous relationship with Lily Langtry and Alice Keppel, understood the damage that a public scandal involving the wealthiest duke in England could do to the social order he was now responsible for presiding over. The king was credited by those within society's inner circle with personally intervening to end the Westminster scandal. The Australian newspapers reported the king's involvement. The New Zealand press went further, reporting that in addition to a direct plea from the British monarch, many thousands of British pounds had been paid by the Grosvenor family to buy the Athertons' silence. The Duke's mother, Lady Sybil, the Countess Grosvenor, and his stepfather, George Wyndham, who was then serving as Chief Secretary for Ireland and who could not afford the political embarrassment of his stepson's sexual adventures being aired in a London courtroom, were both active in the cover-up. Lady Sybil invited Mrs. Atherton to tea in an attempt to negotiate her silence directly, woman to woman, in the manner that the English aristocracy had always preferred, over porcelain cups in a drawing-room where the conversation could be controlled and the outcome managed without the inconvenience of lawyers. The Grosvenor family's solicitors offered Lieutenant Colonel Atherton £40,000, a sum that in today's terms would exceed £1 million, to drop his petition entirely. Atherton publicly refused. The refusal was reported in the press as a matter of honour. Whether the refusal was as absolute as it appeared is a question that the New Zealand papers answered by reporting that private payments were in fact made. Atherton's petition was submitted, but the affair with the Duke was never aired in court. The Duke had reached a compromise. Mrs. Atherton's adultery was eventually cited in the divorce proceedings that Atherton brought in 1905, but the man named as co-respondent was someone else entirely, the Honourable John Reginald Lopes Yard Buller, not the Duke of Westminster. The decree was made absolute in 1907. The society spectators who crowded the courtroom hoping to hear the Duke's name mentioned left disappointed. He was referred to only as a certain gentleman, a phrase that fooled nobody and satisfied everybody, because the entire point of the exercise was to allow the truth to be known without requiring it to be spoken. The system had protected its own. The divorce was a public event conducted under the terms of a private agreement, and the woman at the centre of it emerged with her marriage dissolved, her reputation shattered, and no legal recourse against the man whose family had bought the silence that made the cover-up possible. She did not revert to her maiden name. She continued to use the name Mrs. Atherton, to which she was no longer legally entitled because it was the only name the public knew, and because the name itself had become, in a strange way, her most valuable possession. It was the name under which she had been beautiful, famous, and desired. It was the name under which she had been destroyed. It was, in the end, the name under which she would die. The Duke married 4 times in total, divorced 3 of his wives, had multiple affairs including a decade-long relationship with Coco Chanel, during which he gave her jewellery, purchased a house for her in Mayfair, and provided the land on the French Riviera where she built her villa, La Pausa. He died at 74 on his Scottish estate, with a net worth that made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. Mrs. Atherton was left with a ruined reputation, a dead child, and a famous name that she was no longer legally entitled to use. In 1907, the year her divorce was finalised, Mrs. Atherton brought an action for breach of promise against Captain John Yard Buller, 3rd Baron Churston, who had proposed to her and then married a music hall singer named Denise Orme on April 24, 1907. The case was heard at the High Court, with Justice Charles Darling, later the 1st Baron Darling, presiding. The courtroom was crowded with a fashionable gathering, as the New York Times reported, the kind of audience that attended these proceedings, the way a later generation would attend the cinema. Yard Buller's love letters to Mrs. Atherton were read aloud in court, producing the spectacle of a baron's private declarations of affection being consumed by a roomful of strangers who had come for precisely this form of entertainment. Because Mrs. Atherton's divorce decree had not been made absolute at the time the promise was allegedly made, the judge questioned whether a promise of marriage could be binding while the plaintiff was still technically married to another man. The legal technicality was, in a sense, a metaphor for Mrs. Atherton's entire situation. She was caught between one marriage that had ended and another that would never begin, occupying a social and legal no-man's land in which she was neither wife nor free woman, and in which every step she took produced another courtroom appearance, another set of headlines, and another reduction in the capital of respectability that she had been spending since the Mount Nelson Hotel. Mrs. Atherton waived her claim for damages. Judgment was entered in her favour with costs. The victory was nominal. The Baron kept his music hall singer and his title. Mrs. Atherton kept her legal bills and her reputation for generating litigation with the same frequency and inevitability that other women of her class generated invitations to garden parties. In 1905, she had taken up with Baron Eckartstein, a German diplomat based at the German embassy in London, who was himself in the middle of a marital crisis. His wife, Grace Emily Blundell Maple, the daughter of Sir John Blundell Maple, the furniture magnate who owned the department store Maple and Company, had given birth to another man's child. Eckerdstein had been a diplomat since 1888, serving at the German embassy in various posts, and his social interests had earned him a prominent place in Britain's leading circles. He invited Mrs. Atherton to Germany to meet his mother. The companionship between a notorious English divorcee and a German diplomat whose wife had cuckolded him was, by the standards of the Edwardian social world, a pairing of mutual convenience and mutual damage. Both parties had reputations that were already beyond repair, and both understood that the company of the equally compromised was the only company available. Eckerdstein's wife would eventually divorce him and marry Archibald Weigel in 1910, completing a circuit of connections between the Dean Paul world and the Weigel world that would recur when Mrs. Atherton arrived in Egypt and found Arthur Weigel, Archibald's cousin, waiting to show her the temples. Then came the Stirling case, which occupied British newspaper readers for the better part of 1908 to 1909, with a level of public fascination that made the Westminster affair look like a private disagreement. Captain John Alexander Stirling, Laird of Kippendavie, was a Scots Guards officer 10 years younger than Mrs. Atherton. They met secretly at an apartment in the Cadogan Hotel on Pont Street, Knightsbridge, the same hotel where Oscar Wilde had been arrested a decade earlier. The choice of venue was noted by the press with an irony that the participants did not seem to have intended. The Cadogan Hotel had, by this point in its history, become a byword for a particular kind of Edwardian scandal, a place where illicit meetings occurred in an atmosphere of respectability that everyone understood was a fiction. Clara Stirling, the captain's wife, an American-born actress and former chorus girl, petitioned for divorce and named Mrs. Atherton as co-respondent. Captain Stirling filed his own counter-petition, alleging that Clara had committed adultery with Thomas Uchter Knox, Viscount Northland, the son of the 5th Earl of Ranfurly, an officer in the Coldstream Guards who was 10 years Clara's junior and who would be killed in the First World War in 1915. The case was heard in Edinburgh, and it became a public spectacle of Edwardian morality, class anxiety, and domestic espionage that transfixed the reading public for months. The courtroom was packed each day with fashionable observers who treated the proceedings as a form of theatre, which, in a sense, they were. The prosecution's star witness was Mrs. Atherton's own lady's maid, Thérèse de Gorne, who proved to be a mine of information about her mistress's private life. De Gorne testified about encounters between Mrs. Atherton and Stirling at locations including Amberley Cottage, Mrs. Atherton's riverfront home in Maidenhead, and the Ocean Hotel in Sandown on the Isle of Wight. A monogrammed handkerchief belonging to Stirling had been found under Mrs. Atherton's pillow. At the Ocean Hotel, the witnesses reported, it had been Jackie dear and Nancy darling. The Daily Mirror reported that a scale model of the Ocean Hotel had been constructed and presented to the court so that the judge could better understand the proximity of the rooms occupied by the various parties. De Gorne, with a thoroughness that suggested personal grudge as much as civic duty, also revealed that her own lover was the Stirling family's valet. Gilbert Sackville, 8th Earl de la Warr, was called to testify after being named by the treacherous lady's maid as a man who had received Mrs. Atherton at a bungalow in Bexhill-on-Sea. De la Warr stated that his intentions towards Mrs. Atherton had always been honourable, and that his wife was also Mrs. Atherton's friend. Evidence was presented of a trip to Paris in June 1908, during which Mr. and Mrs. Stirling, Lord Northland and Mrs. Atherton had travelled together and stayed in adjacent rooms that turned out to be interconnected. Stirling's bedroom had been left untouched. After weeks of testimony, the court ruled in favour of Stirling and Mrs. Atherton. The charges against her were held unfounded. In delivering his judgment, Lord Guthrie criticised all parties, stating that they had led selfish and idle lives. Of Mrs. Atherton, he said she was a lady by birth and fitted to take a conspicuous place in society, but had been ostracised by her own wrongdoing. The verdict was legally favourable. The judicial commentary was personally devastating. She had been cleared of the specific charge and condemned in general terms. The distinction in the social world she inhabited was meaningless. The judge had said what everyone already believed. 2 months later, in February 1909, Mrs. Atherton was physically assaulted in her own London home by Mrs. Taylor, Clara Stirling's mother, who blamed Mrs. Atherton for destroying her daughter's marriage. The headlines read, "Trouble in a Park Lane drawing room." Mrs. Taylor pulled Mrs. Atherton's hair and scratched her face. Clara Stirling lodged an appeal against Lord Guthrie's decision and lost. The Stirlings divorced. Clara married the 5th Marquess of Cholmondeley and became, for a short time, Lady Cholmondeley. Everyone moved on, except Mrs. Atherton. She fled to Egypt as far from the London society hostesses and the journalists as she could get. She chose well. In Luxor, at the Winter Palace Hotel, she found herself at the centre of a social world that had nothing to do with London's charity balls and divorce courts and everything to do with the archaeological excavation of ancient Egypt. The Winter Palace was the meeting point for the European Egyptologists, who were, at that period, in the process of excavating the monuments and tombs that would later yield some of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. She socialised with Alan Gardiner, Arthur Weigel, Flinders Petrie, Gaston Maspero, Theodore Davis, Percy Newbery, Howard Carter and Ronald Storrs. These were men whose lives were governed by scholarship and sand, not by the rigid social hierarchies that had consumed Mrs. Atherton's existence in London. Arthur Weigel, a cousin of the Earl de la Warr's second wife, took her on tours of the monuments and described her in his letters to his American-born wife, Hortense, back in London as the beautiful Mrs. Atherton. The letters were a mistake. Hortense was furious. Weigel's close family compared Mrs. Atherton to the devilish heroine in Robert Hitchens' 1909 novel Belladonna, a story about a dangerous woman in Egypt, a comparison that was pointed in its cruelty and precise in its literary timing. Weigel invited Mrs. Atherton to social dinners with a frequency that generated gossip even among the archaeologists, a community not usually given to the kind of social surveillance that was standard practice in Mayfair. The gossip reached London. The London circle absorbed it. Mrs. Atherton had gone to Egypt to escape her reputation, and her reputation had followed her. Then her sister-in-law, Lady Irene Dean Paul, the Belgian-born pianist and composer professionally known as Poldowski, whose own marriage to Mrs. Atherton's brother Aubrey had been brokered by the soprano Nellie Melba, and who was herself a woman of formidable artistic talent and equally formidable opinions, claimed publicly that Mrs. Atherton had been thrown out of the Savoy Hotel in Cairo. The claim was made to Richard Stackpoole, who was married to Mrs. Atherton's own sister Edith, which meant that the slander had been delivered within the family, to a member of the family about a member of the family, with the specific intent of ensuring that the information would circulate through exactly the channels where it would cause maximum damage. Mrs. Atherton sued for slander. She went to the Dean Paul residence to confront Lady Irene directly and was told to her face that she was a disreputable woman. The trial that followed was, even by the standards of Mrs. Atherton's litigation history, painful. She presented herself as a victim of circumstance and social jealousy. Lady Irene's defence was the truth, or at least a version of it that the jury found more persuasive than Mrs. Atherton's protestations of innocence. The jury awarded her 1 farthing in damages. A farthing was the smallest denomination in the British currency system, a quarter of a penny, a coin so insignificant that its primary function in the Edwardian economy was to make change for amounts too small to matter. The jury was saying, in the language of the coinage, that Mrs. Atherton's reputation was worth almost nothing, and that the effort of defending it in court had been, from the jury's perspective, barely worth the trouble of assembling 12 men to consider it. Colonel Atherton, by now exhausted by his former wife's perpetual presence in the newspapers, asked her to remarry him for the sake of the children. She refused. The refusal was characteristic. Mrs. Atherton would accept many things. She would accept scandal, litigation, physical assault, a farthing in damages, and the judgment of a Scottish lord who told her she had been ostracised by her own wrongdoing, but she would not accept a return to a marriage she had already destroyed. Whatever else she was not a woman who went backwards. During the First World War she lowered her profile. The press had other concerns. The Edwardian world of country houses and military balls and society hostesses who kept ledgers of who was sleeping with whom had been swept away by the guns of August 1914 and would never return in its previous form. The young officers she had known, the men who had filled the courtrooms and the dinner parties and the Cadogan Hotel, were dying in France and Belgium at a rate that made their peacetime indiscretions seem trivial. Lord Northland, the Coldstream Guards officer who had been named in the Sterling divorce case as Clara's lover, was killed in 1915. Mrs. Atherton featured once in Tatler in August 1915, photographed in a bathing suit on the steps of the Wentworth Hotel in Aldeburgh, Suffolk, and once in the water. The photographs show a woman of 43 who was still, by the standards of the era, attractive, still capable of drawing attention, still performing the role of society beauty even in a seaside hotel during a war. She published her novel, Grey Sand, under the name Mamie Atherton, through Everett and Company in 1915. It was the story of a mock marriage and its catastrophic effect on the political career of the hero, a premise that drew quite directly on her own experience of the ways in which private arrangements between men and women could destroy public standing. The novel was her attempt to convert the raw material of her life into art, to take control of a narrative that had been written about her for 15 years by gossip columnists and court reporters, and to reshape it on her own terms. She was working on a second novel at the time of her death. The second novel was never finished. At the end of 1917, she was knocked down by a motor car on Regent Street. She suffered fractures to her collarbone and shoulder blade and eye injuries. She was awarded £300 in damages. The accident was another in the sequence of physical misfortunes that seemed to punctuate her life, as if the world itself were taking aim at her in ways that were both random and relentless. By 1919 she was 47 years old, a wealthy divorcee of independent means, weary of publicity, weary of litigation, and weary of a social world that had paraded her through courtrooms, gossip columns, and drawing-room assaults for nearly 2 decades. She had, in 1904, survived a serious house fire while staying in the countryside with her 4-year-old son Aubrey, suffering injuries that kept her out of the public eye for a period. She had endured the slander suit, the farthing, the motor car accident, and the slow erosion of a reputation that had once been her primary asset. She was working on her second novel when she decided to remarry. Her choice of second husband was the Honourable Arthur Ernest Henry Elliot, a man whose background was distinguished and whose character was not. Ernie Elliot was a playwright with a passion for Edwardian musical comedy, a cousin of the 1st Viscount Wimborne and the 8th Earl of Bessborough, educated at Charterhouse like her first husband, a veteran of the Boer War who had served with the Indian Division in France during the First World War, and a man who had been declared bankrupt 3 times and married twice before Mrs. Atherton accepted his hand. His mother was Constance Rhiannon Guest, the daughter of Lady Charlotte Guest, one of the most accomplished women of the Victorian era. His father was Colonel the Honourable Charles Cornwallis Elliot, a courtier and army officer, son of the 3rd Earl of St. Germans. The pedigree was impeccable. The man who carried it was, by the account of his own family's published history, the black sheep of the Elliots. He had struggled badly after returning from the Boer War. In the 1911 census, he listed his occupation as journalist for the editor of Vanity Fair. By 1913, he was working as a manager for Charles Cochrane at the Olympia Circus. He had achieved some theatrical success as the co-author of The Better 'Ole, a hit London production in 1917 that ran for over 800 performances at the Oxford Music Hall, based on the cartoons of Bruce Bairnsfather, and later opened at the Greenwich Village Theatre in New York to positive reviews. His collaborator was Bairnsfather himself, the prominent British humorist and cartoonist whose wartime drawings had become some of the most recognised images of the Western Front. Elliot was charming, connected, theatrically talented in a minor way, financially ruined in a major way, and already married to failure when Mrs. Atherton walked into his life. That she chose him tells you something about what was available to a twice notorious, once beautiful 47-year-old woman in post-war London, and about the narrowing of options that the passage of time and the accumulation of scandal had produced. They married on April 26, 1919. The honeymoon was in the Mediterranean. The relationship between the newlyweds was already deteriorating before they returned to London. What Mrs. Atherton discovered upon their return was the kind of betrayal that makes the earlier scandals of her life look civilised by comparison. She found Elliot in bed with Miss Nellie Cornell, his 24-year-old stepdaughter from his second marriage. Shortly after this discovery, she learned that he was also providing long-term financial support to a dancer from Murray's Cabaret Club on Beak Street in Soho. She attempted to salvage the marriage. Mediation was arranged with Elliot's brother in an attempt to repair the damage. The mediation failed. Elliot refused to return to her. Mrs. Atherton, according to Elliot's later testimony at the inquest, began sending anonymous threatening letters, a claim that, if true, suggests a woman in the final stages of a desperation that had accumulated across 20 years of public scrutiny, private loss, and the particular cruelty of a social world that had never forgiven her for being beautiful and desired, and for acting on those desires in ways that the men around her acted on routinely and without consequence. What happened between April the 26th to July 9th was a period of 74 days during which Mrs. Atherton absorbed the full weight of everything that had been accumulating across her life. The affair with the Duke at the age of 28, the divorce that cost her her marriage and her standing, the dead child in the brougham carriage, killed by a horse frightened by a bear, the courtrooms of London and Edinburgh, the handkerchief under the pillow, the lady's maid who betrayed her secrets, the breach of promise suit, the farthing in damages, the Egyptologist who called her beautiful while his wife fumed in London, the motor car on Regent Street, the sister-in-law who called her disreputable. And now a husband who had been in his stepdaughter's bed before the honeymoon luggage was unpacked, and who was spending her money on a cabaret dancer in Soho. There were, the newspapers speculated, other pressures. The Duke of Westminster had recently finalised his divorce from Sheila and was pursuing Violet Mary Nelson, who was 19 years younger than Mrs. Atherton. The woman who had once captivated him was watching from the margins as the most powerful man she had ever known replaced his first wife with someone born in the decade after Mrs. Atherton's own social destruction had begun. The parallel was not lost on anyone who knew the history. Her last day began normally. On July 9th, 1919, she woke and ate breakfast. She left her home alone and during the day visited the Royal Academy. Upon returning to 47 Curzon Street, Mayfair, she spoke to her maid about the works of art she had enjoyed. The maid noticed nothing unusual in her composure. Later that evening, Mrs. Atherton put on her jewels, sat down, and wrote 2 letters, one to a close friend and one to her husband. She then locked her bedroom door from the inside, barricaded furniture against it, sat down in a chair, and shot herself in the head with a sporting gun. The maid heard the gunshot and could not open the door. A doctor was called. The door was forced open. Mrs. Atherton was found slumped in the chair, decked in her jewellery, having suffered a mortal head wound. The New York Times reported the event the following day, describing it as an apparent suicide. One British paper implied the involvement of a third party. The inquest, held on the Friday of the same week, said otherwise. At the inquest, Elliot stated that Mrs. Atherton had received £4,000 to £5,000 a year in income. Miss Nellie Cornell took the stand and denied any impropriety with her stepfather. Elliot's defence was that his new wife had been sending him anonymous threatening letters which had forced him to leave the home. The verdict was suicide while of an unsound mind. Bruce Bairn's father, who had been collaborating with Elliot on theatrical projects at the time, immediately distanced himself from the scandal in order to prevent it from damaging his reputation. The Daily Herald observed that, in her life as well as in its tragic end, Mrs. Atherton, as far as one can judge, seems to have been a follower of Nietzsche's famous adage, "Live dangerously." Mrs. Atherton was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery under the name Mabel Elliot. She left no will. Letters of administration were granted to her sister, Edith Stackpoole, of 10 West Chapel Street, Mayfair. A few months later, the press reported that her estate was valued at just £8,206. For a woman who had been described for 18 years as wearing priceless jewels and displaying independent wealth, the figure was startling. The newspapers that had covered her scandals with such relish now speculated about whether financial decline had contributed to her decision, whether the fortune she had always appeared to possess was, like so much else in her life, a performance. The speculation in the global press about why she killed herself ran along several lines: Elliot's betrayal, his refusal to return to the marriage, her financial difficulties, her inability to cope with ageing. Several papers noted the timing. The Duke of Westminster had recently divorced his first wife, Sheila, and taken up with Violet Mary Nelson, who was 19 years younger than Mrs. Atherton. The woman who had once captivated the Duke was now 47, twice divorced, newly abandoned, and the Duke was pursuing someone born when Mrs. Atherton was already a married woman with a dead child and a ruined reputation. Public fascination with her suicide continued well into the 1920s. American newspapers drew comparisons with other high-profile society suicides of the era. She was linked to Clara Ward, Princess de Caramont-Chimay, another society beauty whose story ended in the gradual loss of status and the slow erosion of everything that status had been built on. The comparisons were apt. Mrs. Atherton's life was, in its trajectory, a study in how the Edwardian social system could elevate a woman on the basis of her appearance and then dismantle her on the basis of her behaviour, deploying standards of conduct that the men around her were never required to meet. The Duke of Westminster had 4 wives, multiple mistresses, a decade-long affair with Coco Chanel, and died wealthy, titled, and undamaged at 74. Captain Stirling won his divorce case and continued with his life. Baron Churston married his music hall singer and remained a baron. Every man who passed through Mrs. Atherton's life emerged from the encounter with his reputation and his fortune intact. She emerged from each one with less of both until by the end she had neither, and sat down in a chair in a Mayfair bedroom with a gun across her lap and her jewellery around her neck, as if dressing for one last dinner party to which she was the only guest. Her son, Aubrey James Atherton, followed his father into the 12th Lancers, joined as a second lieutenant in March 1919, just weeks before his mother's remarriage, and later became a farmer in Kenya. He was based in Ruiru in Kenya's central province by 1922 and ran the Thago River estate near Naro Moru by 1928. He returned to England before the Second World War and retired to Conwy, Wales, where he died on June 18, 1977. His father, Colonel Thomas Atherton, who had fought at Magersfontein, at the Siege of Kimberley, at Diamond Hill, and who had been mentioned in Lord Roberts's dispatches and received the Companion of the Bath, died in 1920, 1 year after his former wife. Elliot remarried in 1933, 14 years after Mrs. Atherton's death. His 4th wife was an Argentine-born racecourse owner named Eleanor White Hughes Brownlee. Elliot, described by the Elliot family's own history as the black sheep of the family, died in a North London nursing home in 1936. He was 62 years old. He had been bankrupt 3 times, married 4 times, co-authored a hit play, and outlived the woman whose jewellery and whose life he had helped to destroy. The niece who inherited the Dean Paul name, Brenda Dean Paul, Mabel's brother Aubrey's daughter, continued the family pattern of spectacular public destruction. Born in 1907, raised Catholic, educated in convent schools, she was drawn to Berlin's nightlife in the late 1920s, failed a screen test in 1927, and was quickly consumed by the drug culture of the Weimar Republic. She appeared in court for the first time in 1931, charged with bouncing a cheque. She was sentenced to Holloway Prison in 1932, where she developed bulimia and dropped to 5 stone, roughly 70 pounds. She was in and out of nursing homes, care facilities, psychiatric hospitals, and courtrooms for the rest of her life. Her court appearances, each one reported in the press with the same prurient attention that had been lavished on her aunt, produced a catalogue of offences that included possession of dangerous drugs, obtaining goods on false pretences, and theft of services for refusing to pay taxi drivers. In 1939, she was evicted from her flat for walking about naked and answering the door in the nude. A former flatmate wrote to the police in 1952 to report that she supplemented her income by allowing sadists to whip her. She was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Rome in 1957 with a parcel of cocaine in her possession. She died in London on July 26, 1959, aged 52. Her autobiography, My First Life, ghost-written and published in 1935 during a brief period of sobriety, reads like a confession from a woman who understood exactly what was happening to her and could not stop it. The bright young thing who had dazzled the 1920s, who had sought a career in silent film and been drawn instead into Berlin's nightlife and London's drug underworld, was the daughter of a baronet who sang baritone under a pseudonym and a Belgian-born pianist who composed under another, the niece of a woman who had been one of the most beautiful women in England, and the inheritor of a family tradition in which talent, beauty, and self-destruction ran through the generations like a title that no one could refuse and no one could survive. The Dean Paul story is not the story of one woman. It is the story of a family, a class, a system, and an era in which women of extraordinary beauty and limited options were placed at the centre of a social machinery that celebrated them, consumed them, and discarded them with an efficiency that the men who operated that machinery never had to account for. Mrs. Atherton was described by Lord Guthrie as a lady by birth who had been ostracised by her own wrongdoing. The description was accurate as far as it went. What it did not say was that the wrongdoing was substantially shared by men of higher rank and greater wealth, none of whom were ostracised, and that the system that judged her was one in which a duke could sleep with a married woman in a military camp during a war, hide behind the intervention of the king, marry another woman a week before being named as co-respondent, and emerge from the entire affair without a scratch on his reputation, while the woman he had slept with spent the rest of her life being dragged through courtrooms, gossip columns, and drawing-room assaults until she could not bear it any longer and chose to stop. She had been described by the press for 18 years as a fascinating disturber of society. The phrase is worth examining. It frames her as the active agent, the disturber, the woman who disrupted the peace of a world that would have functioned perfectly without her interference. What it does not acknowledge is that the world she disturbed was one that ran on male desire, male money, and male power, and that her function within it was to be desired, to be pursued, and then to be punished for having been caught. The Duke desired her and was not punished. Stirling desired her and was not punished. Yardabulla promised to marry her and married someone else and was not punished. Eliot married her, slept with his stepdaughter, and was not punished. Mrs. Atherton was punished every time, and the punishment was always public, always reported, and always framed as the consequence of her own character rather than the consequence of a system that required women like her to exist and then required them to be destroyed for existing. The jewels she wore on the last evening were the only defence she had left. They were the costume of a woman who had spent her life being seen, and who chose, in the end, to be seen one last time on her own terms. She locked the door. She moved the furniture. She sat down. And the beautiful Mrs. Atherton left the dinner party for good.